The Falklands War (Spanish, Guerra de las Malvinas) was a 10-week undeclared war between Argentina and the United Kingdom in 1982 over two British overseas territories in the South Atlantic, the Falkland Islands and its territorial dependency, South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands. The conflict began on 2 April 1982, when Argentina invaded and occupied the Falkland Islands, followed by the invasion of South Georgia the next day. On 5 April, the British government dispatched a naval task force to engage the Argentine Navy and Air Force before making an amphibious assault on the islands. The conflict lasted 74 days and ended with an Argentine surrender on 14 June, returning the islands to British control. In total, 649 Argentine military personnel, 255 British military personnel, and 3 Falkland Islanders were killed during the hostilities. The conflict was a major episode in the protracted dispute over the territory's sovereignty. Argentina claimed and maintains that the islands are Argentine Territory 5, and the Argentine government thus described its military action as the reclamation of its own territory. The British government regarded the action as an invasion of a territory that had been a crown colony since 1841. Falkland Islanders, who have inhabited the island since the early 19th century, are predominantly descendants of British settlers and strongly favor British sovereignty. Neither state officially declared war, although both governments declared the islands a war zone. The conflict had a strong effect in both countries and has been the subject of various books, articles, films, and songs. Patriotic sentiment ran high in Argentina, but the unfavorable outcome prompted large protests against the ruling military government, hastening its downfall and the democratization of the country. In the United Kingdom, the conservative government, bolstered by the successful outcome, was re-elected with an increased majority the following year. The cultural and political effect of the conflict has been less in the UK than in Argentina, where it has remained a common topic for discussion. 6. Diplomatic relations between the United Kingdom and Argentina were restored in 1989 following a meeting in Madrid, at which the two governments issued a joint statement. 7. No change in either country's position regarding the sovereignty of the Falkland Islands was made explicit. In 1994, Argentina adopted a new constitution, 8, which declared the Falkland Islands as part of one of its provinces by law. 9. However, the islands continue to operate as a self-governing British overseas territory. 10. Prelude. Main article: Events leading to the Falklands War. Failed diplomacy. In 1965, the United Nations called upon Argentina and the United Kingdom to reach a settlement of the sovereignty dispute. The UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, FCO, regarded the islands as a nuisance and barrier to UK trade in South America. Therefore, while confident of British sovereignty, the FCO was prepared to cede the islands to Argentina. When news of a proposed transfer broke in 1968, elements sympathetic with the plight of the islanders were able to organize an effective parliamentary lobby to frustrate the FCO plans. Negotiations continued, but in general failed to make meaningful progress. The islanders steadfastly refused to consider Argentine sovereignty on one side, whilst Argentina would not compromise over sovereignty on the other. 11. The FCO then sought to make the islands dependent on Argentina, hoping this would make the islanders more amenable to Argentine sovereignty. A communications agreement signed in 1971 created an Airlink, and later YPF, the Argentine Oil Company, was given a monopoly in the islands. 12. In 1977, the British Prime Minister, James Callaghan, in response to heightened tensions in the region and the Argentine occupation of southern Thule, secretly sent a force of 2 frigates and a nuclear-powered submarine, HMS Dreadnought, to the South Atlantic, codenamed Operation Journeyman. 13. It is unclear whether the Argentines were aware of their presence, but British sources state that they were advised of it through informal channels. Nevertheless, talks with Argentina on Falkland sovereignty and economic cooperation opened in December of that year, though they proved inconclusive. 14. In 1980, a new UK Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Nicholas Ridley, went to the Falklands trying to sell the islanders the benefits of a leaseback scheme, which met with strong opposition from the islanders. On his return to London in December 1980, he reported to Parliament, but was viciously attacked over what was seen as a sellout. 15. It was unlikely that leaseback idea would have progressed further anyway, since the British had sought a long-term lease of 99 years, whereas Argentina was pressing for a much shorter period of only 30 years. At a private committee meeting that evening, it was reported that Ridley said, "If we don't do something, they will invade. And there is nothing we could do." The Argentine junta. Jorge Aña was the driving force in the junta's decision to invade. 1718-19. Leopoldo Galtieri, leader of the Argentine junta. In the period leading up to the war, and in particular following the transfer of power between the military dictators General Jorge Rafael Videla and General Roberto Eduardo Viola late in March 1981, Argentina had been in the midst of devastating economic stagnation and large-scale civil unrest against the national reorganization process. The military junta that had been governing the country since 1976, 2021. In December 1981, there was a further change in the Argentine military regime, bringing to office a new junta headed by General Leopoldo Galtieri, acting president, Air Brigadier Basilio Lamy Doze, and Admiral Jorge Aña. Aña was the main architect and supporter of a military solution for the long-standing claim over the islands. 22. Expecting that the United Kingdom would never respond militarily. 23. By opting for military action, the Galtieri government hoped to mobilize the long-standing patriotic feelings of Argentines towards the islands, diverting public attention from the chronic economic problems and the ongoing human rights violations of its dirty war. 24. Bolstering the junta's dwindling legitimacy. The newspaper La Prensa speculated on a step-by-step plan beginning with cutting off supplies to the islands, ending in direct actions late in 1982 if the UN talks were fruitless. 25. The ongoing tension between the two countries over the islands increased on 19 March, when a group of Argentine scrap metal merchants, which had been infiltrated by Argentine Marines, 26, raised the Argentine flag at South Georgia Island, an act that would later be seen as the first offensive action in the war. The Royal Navy ice patrol vessel HMS Endurance was dispatched from Stanley to South Georgia on the 25th in response. The Argentine military junta, suspecting that the UK would reinforce its South Atlantic forces, ordered the invasion of the Falkland Islands to be brought forward to 2 April. The UK was taken by surprise by the Argentine attack on the South Atlantic Islands, despite repeated warnings by Captain Nicholas Barker, commanding officer of the Endurance, and others. Barker believed that Defense Secretary John Nott's 1981 Defense White Paper, in which Nott described plans to withdraw the Endurance, the UK's only naval presence in the South Atlantic, had sent a signal to the Argentines that the UK was unwilling and would soon be unable to defend its territories and subjects in the Falklands. 27-28. Argentine invasion. Main articles: 1982 Invasion of the Falkland Islands, Invasion of South Georgia, Argentine Air Forces in the Falklands War, Argentine Naval Forces in the Falklands War, and Argentine Ground Forces in the Falklands War. Argentine soldiers and Falklanders in 1982. On 2 April 1982, Argentine forces mounted amphibious landings, known as Operation Rosario, 29, on the Falkland Islands. 30. The invasion was met with a fierce but brief defense organized by the Falkland Islands governor, Sir Rex Hunt, giving command to Major Mike Norman of the Royal Marines. The garrison consisted of 68 Marines and 11 naval hydrographers, 31, assisted by 23 volunteers of the Falkland Islands Defense Force, FIDF, who had few weapons and were used as lookouts. 32. The invasion started with the landing of Lieutenant Commander Guillermo Sanchez Sabarat's Amphibious Commandos Group, who attacked the empty Moody Brook Barracks and then moved on Government House in Stanley. When the 2nd Marine Infantry Battalion with assault amphibious vehicles arrived, the governor ordered a ceasefire and surrendered. 33. The governor, his family and the British military personnel were flown to Montevideo, Uruguay. 34. That afternoon and later repatriated to the United Kingdom. 35. Initial British response. Further information. British naval forces in the Falklands War, British ground forces in the Falklands War, and British air services in the Falklands War. The cover of Newsweek magazine, 19 April 1982, depicting HMS Hermes, flagship of the British task force. The headline evokes the 1980 Star Wars sequel. The British had already taken action prior to the 2 April invasion. In response to events on South Georgia, on 29 March ministers decided to send the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, RFA, Fort Austin south from the Mediterranean to support HMS Endurance, and the nuclear-powered fleet submarine HMS Spartan from Gibraltar, with HMS Splendid ordered south from Scotland the following day. 36. 7537. Lord Carrington had wished to send a third submarine, but the decision was deferred due to concerns about the impact on operational commitments. 37. Coincidentally, on 26 March, the submarine HMS Superb left Gibraltar, and it was assumed in the press she was heading south. There has since been speculation that the effect of those reports was to panic the Argentine junta into invading the Falklands before submarines could be deployed. 37. However, post-war research has established that the final decision to proceed was made at a junta meeting in Buenos Aires on 23 March. 38. The following day, during a crisis meeting headed by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the First Sea Lord and Chief of the Naval Staff, Admiral Sir Henry Leach, advised that Britain could and should send a task force if the islands are invaded. On 1 April, Leach sent orders to a Royal Navy force carrying out exercises in the Mediterranean to prepare to sail south. Following the invasion on 2 April, after an emergency meeting of the Cabinet, approval was given to form a task force to retake the islands. This was backed in an emergency sitting of the House of Commons the next day. 39. Some of the advanced group, pennant numbers painted over, off Gibraltar, March 1982. Word of the invasion first reached the UK from Argentine sources. 40. A Ministry of Defence operative in London had a short telex conversation with Governor Hunt's telex operator, who confirmed that Argentines were on the island and in control. 4041. Later that day, the BBC journalist Laurie Margali spoke with an islander at Goose Green via amateur radio, who confirmed the presence of a large Argentine fleet and that Argentine forces had taken control of the island. 40 British military operations in the Falklands War were given the codename Operation Corporate, and the commander of the task force was Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse. Operations lasted from 1 April 1982 to 20 June 1982. 42. On 6 April, the British government set up a war cabinet to provide day-to-day political oversight of the campaign. 43. This was the critical instrument of crisis management for the British, with its remit being to keep under review political and military developments relating to the South Atlantic, and to report as necessary to the Defense and Overseas Policy Committee. The War Cabinet met at least daily until it was dissolved on 12 August. Although Margaret Thatcher is described as dominating the War Cabinet, Lawrence Freedman notes in the official history of the Falklands campaign that she did not ignore opposition or fail to consult others. However, once a decision was reached, she did not look back. 43. United Nations Security Council Resolution 502. On 31 March 1982, the Argentine ambassador to the UN, Eduardo Roca, began attempting to garner support against a British military buildup designed to thwart earlier UN resolutions calling for both countries to resolve the Falklands dispute through discussion. 36. 134 On 2 April, the night of the invasion, a banquet was held at Roca's official residence for the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Jeane Kirkpatrick, and several high-ranking officials of the United States Department of State and the United States Department of Defense. This led British diplomats to view Kirkpatrick, who had earlier called for closer relationships with South American dictatorships, with considerable suspicion. 44. On 1 April, London told the UK ambassador to the UN, Sir Anthony Parsons, that an invasion was imminent and he should call an urgent meeting of the Security Council to get a favorable resolution against Argentina. 45. Parsons had to get 9 affirmative votes from the 15 council members, not a simple majority, and to avoid a blocking vote from any of the other 4 permanent members. The meeting took place at 11:00 a.m. on 3 April, New York time 4:00 p.m. in London. United Nations Security Council Resolution 502 was adopted by 10-1, with Panama voting against, and 4 abstentions. Significantly, the Soviet Union and China both abstained. 46-47-48, the resolution stated. Deeply disturbed at reports of an invasion on 2 April 1982 by armed forces of Argentina. Determining that there exists a breach of the peace in the region of the Falkland Islands, Islas Malvinas. Demands an immediate cessation of hostilities. Demands an immediate withdrawal of all Argentine forces from the Falkland Islands, Islas Malvinas. Calls on the governments of Argentina and the United Kingdom to seek a diplomatic solution to their differences, and to respect fully the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. This was a significant win for the UK, giving it the upper hand diplomatically. The draft resolution Parsons submitted had avoided any reference to the sovereignty dispute, which might have worked against the UK. Instead, it focused on Argentina's breach of Chapter VII of the UN Charter, which forbids the threat or use of force to settle disputes. 49. The resolution called for the removal only of Argentine forces. This freed Britain to retake the islands militarily if Argentina did not leave, by exercising its right to self-defense allowed under the UN Charter. 36. 141. Argentine occupation. Main article, Occupation of the Falkland Islands. The Argentine Army unit designated for the occupation was the 25th Infantry Regiment, Argentina, a force of about 681 men specially trained and drawn from various regions of Argentina. It was flown into Port Stanley Airport as soon as the runway had been cleared. 50. Once it became clear that the British were sending an amphibious task force, there was a general recall of reservists, and 2 brigades with 8 infantry regiments and support units were dispatched to the islands. By early May, the total Argentine garrison numbered around 13,000 troops. Conscripts from the 1963 intake had only recently been called up, so the previous year's intake was also recalled. Brigadier General Mario Benjamin Menendez was appointed military governor of the Falklands. 51. Argentine military police arrived with detailed files on many islanders. 52. Allowing intelligence officer Major Patricio Dowling to arrest and interrogate those suspected of opposing the occupation. 52. Initially, some islanders deemed anti-Argentine were expelled. 52. Including the Luxton family. 52, and David Colville, 53, editor of the Falklands Times. This move backfired as those expelled gave interviews to the press. Later, 14 other community leaders, including the senior medical officer, were interned at Fox Bay on West Falkland. 54. Concerned by Dowling's conduct, senior Argentine officers removed him from the islands. 52. For nearly a month, the civilian population of Goose Green was confined in the village hall under unpleasant conditions. 55 similar detentions were reported in other settlements. As part of the Argentine occupation, a medical and demographic survey was carried out, including the island's first-ever population census and analysis of blood types, including the Rh factor. This data had been lacking previously, and its absence had posed serious risks for blood transfusions. Citation needed. Due to food shortages and poor logistical support, some Argentine conscripts resorted to slaughtering sheep belonging to islanders in the Goose Green area as a means of survival. Argentine officers and NCOs were accused of imposing harsh field punishments on conscripts. According to accounts like that of Private Alan Craig, food rations often arrived opened or with missing items. 56. Troops garrisoning Port Howard reported severe food deprivation. 57. And according to Max Hastings and Simon Jenkins in the Battle for the Falklands, 1984, attempts to go absent without leave were punished by beatings or being forced to sit for hours with bare feet in freezing water. Private Rito Portillo 58 and Private Remigio Fernandez 59 were reportedly executed or died as a result of abuse by their own officers. Upon returning to the mainland, many soldiers were allegedly forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. 60. Shuttle diplomacy. Margaret Thatcher meets Alexander Haig in London. On 8 April, Alexander Haig, the United States Secretary of State, arrived in London on a shuttle diplomacy mission from U.S. President Ronald Reagan to broker a peace deal based on an interim authority taking control of the island's pending negotiations. After hearing from Thatcher that the task force would not be withdrawn unless the Argentines evacuated their troops, Haig headed for Buenos Aires. 61. There he met the junta and Nicanor Costa Mendes, the foreign minister. Haig was treated coolly and told that Argentine sovereignty must be a precondition of any talks. Returning to London on 11 April, he found the British cabinet in no mood for compromise. Haig flew back to Washington before returning to Buenos Aires for a final protracted round of talks. These made little progress, but just as Haig and his mission were leaving, they were told that Galtieri would meet them at the airport VIP lounge to make an important concession. However, this was canceled at the last minute. On 30 April, the Reagan administration announced that they would be publicly supporting the United Kingdom. 62. British Task Force. Main articles: Falklands War Order of Battle, British Ground Forces and British Logistics in the Falklands War. Distances from British airbases to the Falklands. HMS Invincible, one of 2 available aircraft carriers for the task force. Royal Navy, FAAC Harrier FRS-1. Main article: List of Royal Navy vessels active in 1982. The nuclear-powered submarine Conqueror set sail from Fastlane, Scotland on 4 April. The 2 aircraft carriers Invincible and Hermes and their escort vessels left Portsmouth, England only a day later. 39 on its return to Southampton from a world cruise on 7 April. The ocean liner SS Canberra was requisitioned and set sail 2 days later with the 3 Commando Brigade aboard. 39. The ocean liner Queen Elizabeth II was also requisitioned and left Southampton on 12 May. With the 5th Infantry Brigade on board, 39, the whole task force eventually comprised 127 ships, 43 Royal Navy vessels, 22 Royal Fleet auxiliary ships, and 62 merchant ships. 63. The retaking of the Falkland Islands was considered extremely difficult. The chances of a British counter-invasion succeeding were assessed by the U.S. Navy, according to the historian Arthur L. Herman, as a military impossibility. 64. Firstly, the British were significantly constrained by the disparity in deployable air cover. 65. The British had 42 aircraft, 28 Sea Harrier 66, and 6 Harrier GR 367, available for air combat operations, against approximately 122 serviceable jet fighters, of which about 50 were used as air superiority fighters and the remainder as strike aircraft, in Argentina's air forces during the war. 68. Crucially, the British lacked airborne early warning and control (AEW) aircraft. Planning also considered the Argentine surface fleet and the threat posed by Exocet-equipped vessels or the two Type 209 submarines. 69. By mid-April, the Royal Air Force had set up an airbase on RAF Ascension Island, co-located with Wide Awake Airfield, on the mid-Atlantic British overseas territory of Ascension Island. They included a sizable force of Avro Vulcan B Mk2 bombers, Hanley Page Victor K Mk2 refueling aircraft, and McDonnell Douglas Phantom FGR Mk2 fighters to protect them. Meanwhile, the main British Naval Task Force arrived at Ascension to prepare for active service. A small force had already been sent south to recapture South Georgia. Encounters began in April. The British task force was shadowed by a Boeing 707 aircraft of the Argentine Air Force during their travel to the south. 70. Several of these flights were intercepted by Sea Harriers outside the British-imposed total exclusion zone. The unarmed 707s were not attacked because diplomatic moves were still in progress, and the UK had not yet decided to commit itself to armed force. On 23 April, a Brazilian commercial Douglas DC-10 from VARIG Airlines en route to South Africa was intercepted by British Harriers, who visually identified the civilian plane. 71. Recapture of South Georgia and the attack on Santa Fe. Main article, Operation Paraquet. The South Georgia Force, Operation Paraquet, under the command of Major Guy Sheridan RM, consisted of Marines from 42 Commando, a troop of the Special Air Service SAS, and Special Boat Service SBS troops who were intended to land as reconnaissance forces for an invasion by the Royal Marines, a total of 240 men. All were embarked on RFA Tidespring. First to arrive was the Churchill-class submarine HMS Conqueror on 19 April, and the island was overflown by a Hanley Page Victor aircraft with radar mapping equipment on 20 April to establish that no Argentine ships were in the vicinity. 72. Santa Fe. The first landings of SAS and SBS troops took place on 21 April, but an ill-advised mission to establish an SAS observation post on the Fortuna Glacier had to be withdrawn after 2 helicopters crashed in fog and high winds. On 23 April, a submarine alert was sounded and operations were halted, with Tidespring being withdrawn to deeper water to avoid interception. On 24 April, British forces regrouped and headed in to attack. 73. On 25 April, after resupplying the Argentine garrison in South Georgia, the submarine Santa Fe was spotted on the surface 74 by a Westland Wessex has Mk3 helicopter from HMS Antrim, which attacked the Argentine submarine with depth charges. HMS Plymouth launched a Westland Wasp has Mk1 helicopter, and HMS Brilliant launched a Westland Lynx has Mk2. The Lynx launched a torpedo and strafed the submarine with its pintle-mounted general-purpose machine gun. The Wessex also fired on Santa Fe with its GPMG. The Wasp from HMS Plymouth as well as 2 other Wasps launched from HMS Endurance fired as 12 ASM anti-ship missiles at the submarine, scoring hits. Santa Fe was damaged badly enough to prevent her from diving. The crew abandoned the submarine at the jetty at King Edward Point on South Georgia. 75. With Tidespring now far out to sea, and the Argentine forces augmented by the submarine's crew, Major Sheridan decided to gather the 76 men he had and make a direct assault that day. After a short forced march by the British troops and a naval bombardment demonstration by two Royal Navy vessels, Antrim and Plymouth, the Argentine forces, a total of 190 men, surrendered without resistance to the Royal Marines. 76. The message sent from the naval force at South Georgia to London was, "Be pleased to inform Her Majesty that the white ensign flies alongside the Union Jack in South Georgia. God save the Queen." The Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, broke the news to the media, telling them to just rejoice at that news and congratulate our forces and the Marines. 77. Black Buck Raids. Main article, Operation Black Buck. RAF Avro-Vulcan BMK-2 strategic bomber. On 1 May, British operations on the Falklands opened with the Black Buck 1 attack of a series of 5 on the airfield at Stanley. A Vulcan bomber from Ascension flew an 8,000 nautical mile, 15,000 km, 9,200 mi, round trip, dropping conventional bombs across the runway at Stanley. The mission required repeated aerial refueling using several Victor K-2 tanker aircraft operating in concert, including tanker-to-tanker refueling. 78. The overall effect of the raids on the war is difficult to determine. Historian Lawrence Freedman, who was given access to official sources, comments that the significance of the Vulcan raids remains a subject of controversy. 79. Although they took pressure off the small Sea Harrier force, the raids were costly and used a great deal of resources. The runway was cratered by only one of the 21 bombs, with the single hit to the edge of the runway probably the best that could have been expected. Contrary to some reports, this reduced the capability of the runway to operate Mirage III fast jets but not other, smaller jet fighters, the Pucara, and the Hercules C-130, nor did it cause the Argentine Air Force to deploy Mirage IIIs to defend the capital. 80. Some sources have claimed that, as a result of the raid, the Argentines realized that their mainland was vulnerable, and fighter aircraft were redeployed from the theater to bases further north. 81. But later Argentine sources confirmed that the Vulcan raids did not influence Argentina's decision to move some of its Mirage IIIs from southern Argentina to the Buenos Aires defense zone. 82. This dissuasive effect was watered down when British officials made clear that there would not be strikes on air bases in Argentina. The raids were later dismissed as propaganda by Falklands veteran Commander Nigel Ward. 83. Of the 5 Black Buck raids, 3 were against Stanley Airfield, with the other 2 being anti-radar missions using Shrike anti-radiation missiles. 84. Escalation of the air war. French-built Super, a attendant of the Argentine Naval Aviation. The Falklands had only 3 airfields. The longest and only paved runway was at the capital, Stanley, and even that was too short to support fast jets. Therefore, the Argentines were forced to launch their major strikes from the mainland, severely hampering their efforts at forward staging, combat air patrols, and close air support over the islands. The effective loiter time of incoming Argentine aircraft was low, limiting the ability of fighters to protect attack aircraft, which were often compelled to attack the first target of opportunity, rather than selecting the most lucrative target. 85. Royal Air Force Harrier GR-3s and Royal Navy Sea Harrier FRS-1s on the flight deck of HMS Hermes on 19 May 1982. The first major Argentine strike force comprised 36 aircraft, A-4 Skyhawks, IAI Daggers, English Electric Canberras, and Mirage III escorts, and was sent on 1 May in the belief that the British liberation was imminent or landings had already taken place. Only a section of Grupo 6, flying IAI Dagger aircraft, found ships, which were firing at Argentine defenses near the islands. The Daggers managed to attack the ships and return safely. This greatly boosted the morale of the Argentine pilots, who now knew they could survive an attack against modern warships, protected by radar ground clutter from the islands and by using a late pop-up profile. Meanwhile, Other Argentine aircraft were intercepted by Bay Sea Harriers operating from HMS Invincible. A Dagger 86 and a Canberra were shot down. 87. Combat broke out between Sea Harrier FRS Mk-1 fighters of No. 801 Naval Air Squadron and Mirage III fighters of Group 08. Both sides refused to fight at the other's best altitude until two Mirages finally descended to engage. One was shot down by an AIM-9L Sidewinder air-to-air missile, AAM, while the other escaped but was damaged and without enough fuel to return to its mainland airbase. The plane made for Stanley, where it fell victim to friendly fire from the Argentine defenders, 88. As a result of this experience, Argentine Air Force staff decided to employ A-4 Skyhawks and Daggers only as strike units, the Canberras only during the night, and Mirage IIIs, without air refueling capability or any capable AAM, as decoys to lure away the British Sea Harriers. The decoying would be later extended with the formation of the Escuadron Phoenix, a squadron of civilian jets flying 24 hours a day, simulating strike aircraft preparing to attack the fleet. On one of these flights on 7 June, an Air Force Learjet 35A was shot down by HMS Exeter, killing the squadron commander, Vice Commodore Rodolfo de la Colina, the highest-ranking Argentine officer to die in the war. 8990. British command was concerned about the high attrition of Harriers brought down by anti-air, and committed to use them predominantly for air superiority. 9192. The Harriers were observed to be far more effective than ship-launched missiles to destroy attacking Argentine aircraft. However, at times the operations of Harriers in the air would interfere with a vessel's anti-air systems. 9394. Stanley was used as an Argentine strongpoint throughout the conflict. Despite the Black Buck and Harrier raids on Stanley Airfield, no fast jets were stationed there for air defense, and overnight shelling by detached ships, it was never out of action entirely. Stanley was defended by a mixture of surface-to-air missile (SAM) systems, Franco-German Roland and British Tigercat, and light anti-aircraft guns, including Swiss-built Oerlikon 35 twin cannons and 30 Hispano-Suiza cannon, and German Rheinmetall 20 twin anti-aircraft cannons. More of the anti-aircraft guns were deployed to the airstrip at Goose Green. 9596. Lockheed Hercules transport night flights brought supplies, weapons, vehicles, and fuel, and airlifted out the wounded up until the end of the conflict. 97. The only Argentine Hercules shot down by the British was lost on 1 June when TC-63 was intercepted by a Sea Harrier in daylight 9899. As it was searching for the British fleet northeast of the islands, after the Argentine Navy retired its last SP-2H Neptune due to unreliability. 100. Various options to attack the home base of the 5 Argentine attenders at Rio Grande were examined and discounted Operation Mikado. Subsequently, 5 Royal Navy submarines were lined up, submerged, on the edge of Argentina's 12 nautical mile, 22 km, 14 mi, territorial limit to provide early warning of bombing raids on the British task force. 101. Operation Folklore was a plan to deploy 2 Canberra PR-9 aircraft of No. 39 Squadron RAF, disguised in Chilean Air Force markings, to the Chilean Air Base at Punta Arenas, with the intention of undertaking high-level photo reconnaissance flights over the Falklands. 102. However, the Canberras had reached Belize when the operation was abandoned, after part of the plan had been reported in the British press. 103. Operation Acme was the deployment of a single Nimrod R-1 surveillance aircraft of No. 51 Squadron RAF to the Chilean base at Isla San Felix to gather signals intelligence from Argentinian forces in the Falklands. 104. 3 sorties were conducted. The last on 17 May narrowly avoided being shot down by the Chileans, leading to the cancellation of the operation. 105. More successful was Operation Fingent, the placement of a Marconi S-259 radar on high ground in Tierra del Fuego, from where it could monitor movements at southern Argentinian air bases. The RAF crew wore civilian clothes in the guise of a sales team. 106. Information was passed to Northwood and the task force by means of Operation Shutter, a U.S.-supplied SATCOM system installed at the Chilean Air Force headquarters in Santiago and operated by 2 soldiers of the Royal Corps of Signals. 107. Sinking of Ara General Belgrano. Main article: Sinking of the Ara General Belgrano. Alferez Sabro. On 30 April, the British government had brought into force a 200 nautical mile, 370 kilometer, 230-mile total exclusion zone, TEZ, to replace the previous maritime exclusion zone. Aircraft as well as ships of any nation were liable to be attacked inside it if they were aiding the Argentine occupation. Admiral Sandy Woodward's carrier battle group of 12 warships and 3 supply ships entered the TEZ on 1 May, shortly before the first Black Buck raid, intending to degrade Argentine air and sea forces before the arrival of the amphibious group 2 weeks later. 108. In anticipation, Admiral Anya had deployed all his available warships into 3 task groups. The first was centered around the aircraft carrier Ara 25 de Mayo with 2 old but missile-armed destroyers, and a second comprised 3 modern frigates. Both these groups were intended to approach the TEZ from the north. A third group approaching from the south was led by the Second World War vintage Argentine light cruiser Ara General Belgrano. 109. Although old, her large guns and heavy armor made her a serious threat. On 1 May, the British nuclear-powered submarine HMS Conqueror, one of 3 patrolling the TEZ, located the General Belgrano group and followed it until the following day, when it was about 12 hours away from the task force and just outside the total exclusion zone. Admiral Woodward was aware of the Argentine carrier group approaching from the other direction and ordered the cruiser to be attacked to avoid being caught in a pincer movement. He was unaware that 25 de Mayo had failed to gain enough headwind to launch her aircraft. The order to sink the cruiser was confirmed by the War Cabinet in London, and General Belgrano was hit by 2 torpedoes at 4 p.m. local time on 2 May, sinking an hour later. 110. 321 members of General Belgrano's crew, along with 2 civilians on board the ship, died in the incident. More than 700 men were eventually rescued from the open ocean despite cold seas and stormy weather, enduring up to 30 hours in overcrowded life rafts. 111. The loss of General Belgrano drew heavy criticism from Latin American countries and from opponents of the war in Britain. Support for the British cause wavered amongst some European allies, but the United States remained supportive. 112. The sinking had a crucial strategic effect: the elimination of the Argentine naval threat. After her loss, the entire Argentine fleet, with the exception of the diesel-powered submarine Ara San Luis, 74, returned to port and did not leave again during the fighting. This had the secondary effect of allowing the British to redeploy their nuclear submarines to the coast of Argentina, where they were able to provide early warning of outgoing air attacks leaving mainland bases. 113. The sinking generated significant controversy, including disagreement about the exact nature of the exclusion zone and whether General Belgrano had been returning to port at the time of the sinking. However, in 2003, the ship's captain, Hector Bonzo, stated to a documentary crew that General Belgrano had been maneuvering, not sailing away from the exclusion zone, and that he had orders to sink any British ship he could find. 114. In a separate incident later that night, British forces engaged an Argentine patrol gunboat, the Ara Alferez Sabro, that was searching for the crew of an Argentine Air Force Canberra light bomber shot down on 1 May. 2 Royal Navy Lynx helicopters from HMS Coventry and HMS Glasgow fired 4 Sea-Skua missiles at her. Badly damaged and with 8 crew dead, Alferez Sobral managed to return to Puerto Deseado 2 days later. 115. The Canberra's crew were never found. 116. Sinking of HMS Sheffield. HMS Sheffield. On 4 May, 2 days after the sinking of General Belgrano, the British lost the Type 42 destroyer HMS Sheffield to fire following an Exocet missile strike from the Argentine 2nd Naval Air Fighter Attack Squadron. 117. Sheffield had been ordered forward with 2 other Type 42s to provide a long-range radar and medium-high altitude missile picket far from the British carriers. She was struck amidships, with devastating effect, ultimately killing 20 crew members and severely injuring 24 others. The ship was abandoned several hours later, gutted and deformed by fires. For 4 days she was kept afloat for inspections, and the hope that she might attract Argentine submarines which could be hunted by helicopter. The decision was then taken to tow her to Ascension, but while under tow by HMS Yarmouth, she finally sank east of the Falklands on 10 May. 118. The incident is described in detail by Admiral Woodward in his book 100 Days, in Chapter 1. Woodward was a former commanding officer of Sheffield. 119. The destruction of Sheffield, the first Royal Navy ship sunk in action since the Second World War, had a profound impact on the War Cabinet and the British public as a whole, bringing home the fact that the conflict was now an actual shooting war. 120. Diplomatic activity. The tempo of operations increased throughout the first half of May, as the United Nations' attempts to mediate a peace were rejected by the Argentines. The final British negotiating position was presented to Argentina by UN Secretary-General Javier Pérez de Cuéllar on 18 May 1982. In it, the British abandoned their previous red line, that British administration of the islands should be restored on the withdrawal of Argentine forces, as supported by United Nations Security Council Resolution 502, 121. Instead, it proposed a UN administrator should supervise the mutual withdrawal of both Argentine and British forces, then govern the islands in consultation with the representative institutions of the islands, including Argentines, although no Argentines lived there. Reference to self-determination of the islanders was dropped, and the British proposed that future negotiations over the sovereignty of the islands should be conducted by the UN. 122, however, the proposals were rejected by the Argentines on the same day. 123. Special Forces operations. Given the threat to the British fleet posed by the Attendard Exocet combination, plans were made to use C-130s to fly in SAS troops to attack the home base of the 5 Attendards at Rio Grande, Tierra del Fuego. The operation was codenamed Mikado. The operation was later scrapped, after acknowledging that its chances of success were limited, and replaced with a plan to use the submarine HMS Onyx to drop SBS Marines several miles offshore at night for them to make their way to the coast aboard rubber inflatables and proceed to destroy Argentina's remaining Exocet stockpile, which did not exist at their objective. 124. An SAS reconnaissance team was dispatched to carry out preparations for a seaborne infiltration. A Westland Sea King helicopter carrying the assigned team took off from HMS Invincible on the night of 17 May, but bad weather forced it to land 50 miles 80 km from its target, and the mission was aborted. 125. The pilot flew to Chile, landed south of Punta Arenas, and dropped off the SAS team. The helicopter's crew of 3 then destroyed the aircraft, surrendered to Chilean police on 25 May, and were repatriated to the UK after interrogation. The discovery of the burnt-out helicopter attracted considerable international attention. Meanwhile, the SAS team crossed the border and penetrated into Argentina, but canceled their mission after the Argentines suspected an SAS operation and deployed some 2,000 troops to search for them. The SAS men were able to return to Chile and took a civilian flight back to the UK. 126. On 14 May, the SAS carried out a raid on Pebble Island on the Falklands, where the Argentine Navy had taken over a grass airstrip map for FMA IA-58 Pucará light ground attack aircraft and Beechcraft T-34 Mentors, which resulted in the destruction of several aircraft. NB-127. On 15 May, SBS teams were inserted by HMS Brilliant at Grantham Sound to reconnoiter and observe the landing beaches at San Carlos Bay. 128. On the evening of 20 May, the day before the main landings, an SBS troop and artillery observers were landed by Wessex helicopters for an assault on an Argentine observation post at Fanning Head, which overlooked the entrance of the bay. Meanwhile, the SAS conducted a diversionary raid at Darwin. 129. Air attacks. Main article, Battle of San Carlos, 1982. HMS Antelope smoking after being hit, 23 May. HMS Coventry in 1981. In the landing zone, the limitations of the British ship's anti-aircraft defenses were demonstrated in the sinking of HMS Arden on 21 May, which was hit by 9 bombs, 130, and HMS Antelope on 24 May, when attempts to defuse unexploded bombs failed. 131. Out at sea with the carrier battle group, MV Atlantic Conveyor was struck by an air-launched Exocet on 25 May, which caused the loss of 3 out of 4 Chinook and 5 Wessex helicopters, as well as their maintenance equipment and facilities, together with runway-building equipment and tents. This was a severe blow from a logistical perspective. 12 of her crew members were killed, 132. Also lost on 25 May was HMS Coventry, a sister to Sheffield, whilst in company with HMS Broadsword after being ordered to act as a decoy to draw away Argentine aircraft from other ships at San Carlos Bay. 133. HMS Argonaut and HMS Brilliant were moderately damaged. 68. Argentine A4 Skyhawk attack on HMS Brilliant and HMS Glasgow, 12 May 1982. Many British ships escaped being sunk because of limitations imposed by circumstances on Argentine pilots. To avoid the highest concentration of British air defenses, Argentine pilots released bombs at very low altitude, and hence those bomb fuses did not have sufficient time to arm before impact. The low release of the retarded bombs, some of which the British had sold to the Argentines years earlier, meant that many never exploded, as there was insufficient time in the air for them to arm themselves. In B-2, the pilots would have been aware of this, but due to the high concentration required to avoid surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft artillery, AAA, and British Sea Harriers, many failed to climb to the necessary release point. The Argentine forces solved the problem by fitting improvised retarding devices, allowing the pilots to effectively employ low-level bombing attacks on 8 June. Atlantic Conveyor approaching the Falklands, on or about 19 May 1982. 13 bombs hit British ships without detonating. 134. Lord Craig, the retired Marshal of the Royal Air Force, is said to have remarked, 6 better fuses and we would have lost. 135. Although Ardent and Antelope were both lost despite the failure of bombs to explode, and Argonaut was put out of action. The fuses were functioning correctly, and the bombs were simply released from too low an altitude. 136-137. The Argentines lost 22 aircraft in the attacks. In B-3. In his autobiographical account of the Falklands War, Admiral Woodward blamed the BBC World Service for disclosing information that led the Argentines to change the retarding devices on the bombs. The World Service reported the lack of detonations after receiving a briefing on the matter from a Ministry of Defense official. He describes the BBC as being more concerned with being fearless seekers after truth than with the lives of British servicemen. 136 Colonel H. Jones leveled similar accusations against the BBC after they disclosed the impending British attack on Goose Green by two para. 138 HMS Broadsword and HMS Hermes during the war. On 30 May, two superintendents, one carrying Argentina's last remaining Exocet, escorted by four A-4C Skyhawks each with two 500 lb bombs, took off to attack Invincible. 139 Argentine intelligence had sought to determine the position of the carriers from analysis of aircraft flight routes from the task force to the islands. 139, however. The British had a standing order that all aircraft conduct a low-level transit when leaving or returning to the carriers to disguise their position. 140. This tactic compromised the Argentine attack, which focused on a group of escorts 40 miles, 64 km south of the carrier group. 141. Two of the attacking Skyhawks 141 were shot down by Sea Dart missiles fired by HMS Exeter. 139, with HMS Avenger claiming to have shot down the Exocet missile with her 4.5 gun, although this claim is disputed. 142. No damage was caused to any British vessels. 139 during the war. Argentina claimed to have damaged Invincible and continues to do so. 143. Although no evidence of any such damage has been produced or uncovered.